The wind in Wyoming did not just blow. It hunted. It sought out the cracks in the chinking of the log walls, the gaps in the window frames, and the thin places in the wool coats of the poor. In the winter of 1883, the town of Iron Creek was less a settlement and more a cluster of buildings huddled together against the white death that swept down from the mountains. Clara Hayes sat on the edge of a mattress that had been stuffed with straw and corn husks, listening to the wind scream against the rough-hewn timber of her shack. It was a sound like a woman wailing, a ceaseless, high-pitched keen that grated against her nerves. Inside the single room, the air was so cold that her breath hung before her face in a ghost of gray mist. She looked down at the two small shapes beneath the pile of quilts. Thomas was 7, though he looked 5, his growth stunted by months of hard living. Sarah was only 4. They were asleep, or trying to be, huddled together like stray pups seeking warmth in a storm. Clara adjusted the topmost blanket, a patchwork thing she had sewn when her life was different, when Samuel was alive and the coal stove had burned hot enough to make the windows sweat. Now, the blanket was threadbare, and the stove was a cold iron beast in the corner, holding only the memory of fire. It had been 3 days since they had eaten a proper meal. 3 days since the last of the cornmeal had been scraped from the tin and boiled into a watery gruel that did little to stop the cramping in their bellies. Clara pressed a hand to her own stomach, feeling the hollow ache that had become her constant companion. She could handle the hunger. She could handle the dizziness that seized her when she stood up too fast. But hearing Thomas whimper in his sleep, hearing the empty rumble of Sarah's belly in the quiet of the night, that was a torture she could not endure. She stood up, her knees popping in the cold. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. It was thin wool, dyed a faded indigo, frayed at the hem. She moved to the window and scraped a small circle in the frost that coated the glass. Outside, the town of Iron Creek was a smudge of gray and white. Smoke rose from the chimneys of the Lucky, from the saloon, from the mercantile. She had to try again. Clara checked the children one last time. They were still. She prayed they would stay that way until she returned. She slipped her feet into her boots, the leather cracked and stiff, and stuffed folded newspaper into the toes to keep the chill at bay. She opened the door, slipped out, and pulled it shut quickly to keep what little warmth remained inside. The cold hit her like a physical blow, a heavy hand slapping against her face. She lowered her head and walked into the wind. The snow was packed hard on the main street, rutted by wagon wheels and frozen into jagged ridges. Clara walked with her head down, navigating the treacherous ground by memory. She made her way to the back of the general store, where the butcher, a man named Silas Gower, kept his shop. She had been a proud woman once, when Samuel was alive, when he was pulling wages from the mine before the earth swallowed him up. Clara had walked into Gower's shop with her head high. She had bought roast beef for Sundays and bacon for breakfasts. She had paid in coin, and Gower had smiled and tipped his blood-smeared hat. Now, she lingered at the back door, shivering not just from the cold but from the humiliation that coated her skin like sweat. She knocked, a timid, hollow sound against the heavy wood. The door opened with a groan of hinges. Silas Gower stood there, wiping his hands on a stained apron. The smell of raw meat and sawdust drifted out, thick and metallic, to a starving woman. It smelled like heaven. "Mrs. Hayes," Gower said. His voice was not kind. It was flat, tired. "I told you on Tuesday." "I know, Mr. Gower," Clara said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "I know what you said, but I thought maybe you had some scraps today. Bones for soup, ends of the bacon, anything you were going to throw to the dogs." Gower sighed, leaning against the door frame. He was a heavy man, well-fed, with a face ruddy from the heat of his stove and the brandy he kept under the counter. "I run a business, Clara, not a charity ward. Your husband left half the town holding unpaid tabs when he died. I'm one of them. I will pay you back," Clara promised, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "When the spring comes, I can take in washing. I can plant a garden. Spring is 4 months away, Gower said. He looked past her, toward the gray horizon. And you already owe me for the salt pork you took last month. The owner holds me to account for every ounce of stock. Please, Clara whispered. The word was a shard of glass in her throat. My children. Thomas is sick. He needs broth. Just bones. Mr. Gower. Just the bones. Gower looked at her. For a second, she saw a flicker of pity in his eyes, but it was quickly extinguished by the hardness of life on the frontier. Generosity was a weakness that killed men and businesses alike out here. If I give to you, I have to give to the widow Miller and the Jameson boy, and every other stray that comes scratching at my door, Gower said, hardening his jaw. Go on now. Don't come back unless you have a coin. He closed the door. The latch clicked with a finality that echoed in Clara's chest. She stood there for a long time, staring at the wood, the smell of meat still teasing her senses. She wanted to scream. She wanted to pound her fists against the door until they bled, but she did neither. She turned around and began the long walk back down the alley. The despair was different this time. Before, there had always been a sliver of hope. A neighbor who might spare a cup of flour, a piece of firewood found on the road, the butcher having a moment of kindness. Now, the cupboard was bare. The neighbors were just as poor or tired of her begging, and the butcher had closed his door. She walked past the Red Dog Saloon. The sound of a piano clattered out into the street, mixed with the roar of laughter and the clinking of glass. It was warm there. There was food in there. And there were men in there. Clara stopped. She stood in the shadows of the livery stable across the street, watching the swinging doors of the saloon. She had vowed she would never do it. When Samuel died, when the foreman came to tell her that the mine had collapsed and her husband was gone, she screamed that she would survive. She would raise their children decent and God-fearing. She had sold the furniture. She had sold Samuel's rifle. She had sold her wedding ring. Now, she had nothing left to sell but the one thing she had guarded fiercely. A woman came out of the saloon, hanging on the arm of a miner. The woman was wearing a dress of bright crimson, the fabric cheap but flashy. She was laughing, a shrill, artificial sound, but she looked warm. She looked fed. Clara looked down at her own hands. They were red and chapped, the knuckles swollen from the cold. She touched her face. She was 26 years old, but she felt 50. Yet she knew she was not ugly. Before the hunger took the soft curves of her face, she had been called beautiful. Perhaps there was enough left of that beauty to buy a meal. The thought made bile rise in her throat. She swallowed it down. Pride was for the living. If she did not do something tonight, she feared her children would not be among the living for much longer. She did not go home. She could not face the hollow eyes of her son or the trusting gaze of her daughter with empty hands. She waited in the alley, the darkness wrapping around her like a shroud. Hours passed. The cold seeped through her boots, turning her toes into numb blocks of ice. She stomped her feet silently to keep the blood moving. Around midnight, the doors of the saloon banged open. A man stumbled out, alone. He was a ranch hand, judging by the sheepskin coat and the spurs that jingled faintly as he walked. He was drunk, weaving slightly as he tried to navigate the boardwalk. Clara took a breath. It felt like inhaling needles. She stepped out of the shadows. "Mister," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. Louder. "Mister." The man stopped and turned, blinking at her. He had a heavy beard and watery eyes. He smelled of stale beer and unwashed wool. "Who's that?" he grunted, squinting into the dark. Clara stepped into the pale light cast by the saloon window. She lowered the shawl from her head, letting him see her face. I was wondering if you needed company." The man stared at her for a moment, his slow mind working through the words. Then a grin spread across his face, crooked and leering. "Company? Well now, ain't you a quiet little thing?" He stepped off the boardwalk, closing the distance between them. Clara fought the urge to run. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to flee, to hide, to protect herself, but the image of Thomas and Sarah, shivering under thin blankets, held her feet to the frozen earth. "How much?" the man asked, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rasp. He reached out, his hand heavy and rough, and grabbed her upper arm. His fingers dug into her flesh through the thin coat. Clara flinched but did not pull away. $2, she said. It was a fortune. It was enough for wood and flour and salt pork. $2. The man laughed, a wet, hacking sound. $2. You think highly of yourself, don't you, darling? I got $1 in my pocket. You take that, or I find someone else. $1. It was barely enough, but it was something. All right, Clara whispered. $1. The man pulled her closer, his breath hot and foul against her face. Let's go round back then. Ain't got all night. Clara closed her eyes. She detached herself from her body. She was not Clara Hayes. She was just a vessel, a tool to be used so that her children could eat. She let him pull her toward the darkness behind the saloon. Let her go. The voice came from the shadows of the boardwalk, deep and resonant, cutting through the wind like a knife. It was not a shout, but it carried an authority that froze the drunk man in his tracks. Clara's eyes snapped open. A figure stepped down from the wooden planks into the snowy street. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a long canvas duster that had seen years of hard weather. A black hat was pulled low over his eyes, but Clara could see the glint of them in the moonlight. Steely, alert, and terrifyingly sober. The drunk ranch hand bristled, though he loosened his grip on Clara's arm slightly. This ain't your business, friend. We're concluding a transaction. It didn't look like a transaction, the stranger said. He walked closer, his movements fluid and controlled. He stopped 5 feet away. He did not have a gun in his hand, but his right hand rested casually near the hip of his duster, where the handle of a Colt revolver was visible. It looked like you were bothering a lady. She ain't no lady. The drunk spat, trying to salvage his pride. She's a whore. She named a price. The stranger turned his head slightly, looking at Clara. His face was hard, etched with lines of exposure and exhaustion, but his expression was unreadable. He looked at her frayed coat, her trembling hands, the desperation etched into her pale features. Is that right, ma'am? The stranger asked. His voice was softer when he spoke to her, though still lacking in warmth. Are you selling yourself? Clara felt the shame burn through her, hot and agonizing. She wanted to sink into the snow and die. She wanted the earth to open up and swallow her whole, but she could not lie, not now. I need the money, she choked out. The stranger looked back at the drunk. She's changed her mind. Walk away. The drunk blinked, looking from the stranger's hard face to the gun at his hip. The alcohol courage evaporated, leaving only the instinct for self-preservation. He released Clara's arm and took a step back, holding his hands up. Fine, the drunk muttered. Plenty of other fillies in the stable. I didn't want a skinny one anyway. He turned and stumbled away into the night, muttering curses under his breath. Clara stood alone with the stranger. She was shaking violently now, the adrenaline crashing, leaving her weak and exposed. She wrapped her arms around herself, unable to look him in the eye. She had been saved. Yes, but the humiliation was absolute. She had been caught in the act of discarding her soul. You're Samuel Hayes's widow, the man said. It wasn't a question. Clara looked up, startled. You know me? I know of you, he said. I know your husband died in the glory hole collapse 6 months back. Clara stiffened. If you know who I am, then you know why I'm here. I have nothing. Mister, I have no husband, no money, and no food. The man took a step closer. In the pale light, she could see his face more clearly. He was not a handsome man in the way the town dandies were. His face was a map of harsh terrain, a broken nose that had healed slightly crooked, a scar running along his jawline, eyes that were the color of flint. He looked like the land itself, unforgiving and enduring. I'm Eli Boone, he said. Clara knew the name. Boone lived on a ranch 20 miles out of town, up near the foothills. People said he was a recluse. People said he used to be a bounty hunter, a man who tracked humans for coins before he bought cattle and disappeared into the high country. Mr. Boone, Clara said, bobbing her head slightly. Thank you for sending him away, but you've cost me $1, and my children are starving. There was a flash of defiance in her voice, a spark of the woman she used to be. Eli seemed to notice it. He studied her, his gaze dissecting her misery but not mocking it. You got kids? He asked. A boy and a girl, Clara said. Thomas and Sarah. And you were going to let that drunk paw at you for $1 to feed them? I would do worse than that to keep them alive, Clara said, her voice fierce. I would crawl through glass. Do not judge me. Mr. Boone, you don't know what it is to hear your children cry from hunger until they are too weak to make a sound. Eli fell silent. He looked around the empty street, the wind tugging at the brim of his hat. He seemed to be weighing something in his mind, calculating odds as if he were staring down a fugitive or a difficult horse. I ain't judging you, Mrs. Hayes, he said slowly. I'm looking at the situation. He reached into his coat pocket. Clara's heart leaped. Was he going to give her money? Charity? She would take it. She had no pride left to refuse. But his hand came out empty. He didn't offer a coin. I need a wife, he said. The words hung in the frozen air, absurd and impossible. Clara stared at him, thinking she must have misheard over the howling wind. What? I need a wife, Eli repeated, his voice steady and businesslike. I got a ranch. It's good land, but it's hard work. I got cattle to tend, horses to break. I need someone to keep the house, cook the meals, and mend the clothes. I need a woman in the home. Clara took a step back, clutching her shawl. You're mocking me. This is a cruel joke. I don't joke, Eli said. His eyes bored into hers. And I don't buy women for an hour. That ain't my way. He gestured vaguely toward the mountains. I can offer you a roof that doesn't leak. I can offer you a warm fire. I got a smokehouse full of venison and a cellar with potatoes. Your kids, I can't be a father to them. I don't know anything about that, but I can promise they won't go hungry. They'll have boots on their feet and coats on their backs. Clara's mind reeled. It was madness. A stranger, a man with a reputation for violence, standing in the snow offering marriage like he was trading for a horse. Why? She asked. Why me? You could find a wife anywhere. Why pick a woman you just found trying to sell herself outside a saloon? Eli looked at her, and for the first time, his mask slipped. She saw something ancient and weary in his expression. Because you're desperate, he said bluntly. And desperate people are honest. You ain't playing games. Clara, you're fighting for survival. I respect that. He took a step back, giving her space. I ain't asking for love. I ain't asking for romance. I'm offering a partnership. You run my house. I keep you and yours safe. Marriage makes it legal, stops the tongues from wagging, or at least gives them less to chew on. Clara shook her head. Her thoughts were a chaotic storm. Marriage? To this stranger? To leave the town, the only place she knew, and go into the wilderness with a former killer? I can't, she whispered. I don't know you. You know I stopped a man from hurting you tonight, Eli said. That's more than anyone else in this town did. He tipped his hat. I'm staying at the boarding house tonight. I ride out at dawn. If you want the life, you meet me at the livery stable at first light. If not, good luck to you. Mrs. Hayes. He turned and walked away, his boots crunching rhythmically on the snow. He didn't look back. Clara stood frozen. The offer was terrifying. It was a trap, surely, or a different kind of slavery. But the image of the smokehouse full of venison danced in her mind. She turned and ran. She ran all the way back to the shack on the edge of town. Her lungs burned, the cold air scorching her throat. She burst through the door, slamming it against the wind. The room was darker than when she left. The fire had died completely. The air was freezing. Mama? The voice was weak, wet. Clara rushed to the mattress. Thomas was sitting up, clutching his chest. He was wheezing, a rattling, fluid sound that terrified her. His skin was burning hot to the touch, yet he was shivering violently. "I'm here, baby," Clara soothed, panic rising in her chest like floodwater. "I'm here." "I'm cold," Thomas whispered. "It hurts to breathe." Clara looked at the woodpile. It was empty. Not even a splinter remained. She looked at the empty water bucket. The ice in it was solid. She looked at Sarah, who was sleeping fitfully, curling into a ball to escape the freezing air. If they stayed here another night, Thomas would die. She knew it with the certainty of a mother who had seen death before. The cold would settle into his lungs, and he would simply stop breathing. There was no food. There was no fuel. There was no hope in Iron Creek. Clara looked around the miserable shack. This was not a home. This was a coffin. She thought of Eli Boone. She thought of his hard face, his calloused hands, the gun at his hip. He was dangerous, yes, but he had offered shelter. He had offered food. Desperate people are honest, he had said. Clara stood up. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was outweighed by a ferocious resolve. She would not let her son die. She would sell herself. Yes, but not for an hour. She would sell herself for a lifetime, if that's what it took to buy their lives. She began to pack. It didn't take long. She had so little. She bundled the few clothes they had into a flour sack. She took the Bible that had belonged to her mother. She took the small tin box that held Samuel's death certificate. She woke the children. "Up, babies," she said, her voice brisk and commanding. "We're leaving." "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, rubbing her eyes. Confused by the urgency in her mother's voice. "We're going to a new home," Clara said. She wrapped Thomas in the last blanket, lifting him into her arms despite his weight. He was too weak to walk far. "A warm home, with food." "Is Papa there?" Sarah asked. Clara's heart broke, but she kept her face like stone. "No, baby. Papa's with the angels, but there is a man there. A man who is going to help us." They walked out of the shack, leaving the door unlatched. "Let the wind have it." It was all it was good for. The walk to the livery stable was a nightmare. Thomas was heavy, and the snow was deep. Clara's arms screamed with the effort, but she did not stop. She muttered prayers under her breath. Prayers for strength. Prayers for mercy. The sky was beginning to turn a bruised purple in the east when they reached the stable. The smell of hay and horses was thick and warm. Eli Boone was there. He was cinching the saddle on a massive roan gelding. A buckboard wagon was hitched to two sturdy mules nearby. He heard them coming and turned. He looked at Clara, her face pale and determined, holding the sick boy in her arms, the little girl clinging to her skirt. He looked at the meager sack of belongings on her back. He didn't smile. He didn't say, "I told you so." He walked over and took Thomas from her arms effortlessly. The boy groaned, but settled against the man's thick coat. "He's sick," Clara said, her voice raspy. "His chest is bad." "We got blankets in the wagon," Eli said. "Bear grease and turpentine at the ranch. We'll fix him up." He carried the boy to the wagon and laid him gently in the bed, tucking a heavy buffalo robe around him. He lifted Sarah up next, settling her beside her brother. Then he turned to Clara. He stood there for a moment, looking at her. He pulled a glove off his hand and extended it to her. "Clara Hayes," he said. Clara looked at his hand. It was large, scarred, stained with the work of the ranch. It was a hand that could kill, she knew. But right now, it was an anchor. She reached out and took it. His grip was firm, dry, and surprisingly warm. "Eli Boone," she replied. "Are you ready to ride?" "I have nothing left to leave behind," she said. Eli nodded. He helped her up onto the wagon seat. He climbed up beside her and took the reins. "Yeah!" he called out. The mules leaned into the harnesses. The wagon lurched forward, the wheels crunching over the frozen snow. They moved out of the stable and onto the main street, heading west, toward the mountains and the unknown. Clara didn't look back at the town that had starved her. She looked forward, watching the sun begin to bleed over the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. She was terrified. She was exhausted. She was married in word, if not yet in deed, to a stranger with a dark past. But as the wagon rattled on, she reached back and touched the buffalo robe covering her children. It was thick and warm. For the first time in months, she did not feel the bite of the wind. The wagon wheels groaned against the frozen earth, a rhythmic protest that measured out the miles between the life Clara Hayes was leaving and the uncertain future she was riding toward. The journey to Eli Boone's ranch was not a jaunt. It was a pilgrimage through a landscape that seemed determined to strip a person of their hope. They left the valley floor where Iron Creek festered in its own coal smoke and began the long, arduous climb into the foothills. The air grew thinner here, sharper. It tasted of pine resin and ancient ice. The road was little more than a scar cut through the wilderness, winding between towering stands of lodgepole pine that blocked out the weak winter sun. To the west, the great peaks of the Tetons jagged against the sky like the teeth of a wolf, white and merciless. Clara sat on the buckboard bench, her spine rigid. She held the reins of her fear as tightly as Eli held the leather ribbons guiding the mules. She cast a glance sideways at him. He drove with an easy, practiced competence, his eyes scanning the tree line, the road, the horizon, never resting. He had barely spoken 2 words since they left the livery stable, save to calm the mules when a jackrabbit skittered across the path. In the bed of the wagon, buried beneath the buffalo robe, Thomas and Sarah were silent. Every so often, Clara would reach back, her hand seeking the reassurance of their warmth. Thomas was still wheezing, a dry, rattling sound that cut through the creak of the harness. But he was no longer shivering. The heavy fur, smelling of wild beast and tobacco, was doing its work. It took the better part of the day to reach the property line. The sun was beginning to dip, painting the snow in shades of lavender and bruised purple, when Eli finally pulled on the reins. "We are here," he said. Clara looked up. They had crested a ridge, and below them lay a shallow valley, sheltered on 3 sides by rising timber and protected from the worst of the north wind by a granite bluff. In the center of this white expanse sat a cabin. It was not a shack. It was a structure built to outlast the men who raised it. The logs were thick, peeled ponderosa pine, fitted together with precise notches. A stone chimney anchored one end, puffing a thin line of gray smoke into the twilight. Nearby stood a substantial barn, a corral made of split rails, and a few outbuildings. "It looks strong," Clara said, the words escaping her before she could weigh them. "It holds," Eli replied. He guided the mules down the slope. As they approached the house, Clara braced herself. She had expected squalor. She had expected the bachelor filth of a man living alone in the wilderness. Dirty plates stacked in corners, mud tracked across floors, the smell of unwashed bedding. She prepared herself to become a servant to a man's neglect. But when Eli opened the heavy oak door and ushered them inside, Clara stopped in the entryway. Surprised, the main room was sparse. Yes, there were no lace curtains, no woven rugs, no vases of dried flowers, but it was clean. The floorboards were swept bare. The table was scrubbed to a pale yellow. The cast-iron stove in the corner was blacked and polished, radiating a steady, welcoming heat. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and cedar. Not rot or stagnation. It was the home of a man who possessed discipline, if not comfort. Eli walked past her, his boots thudding softly on the wood. He went to the stove and opened the firebox, tossing in a split log of seasoned pine. "There is a room in the back," Eli said, gesturing to a door on the far wall. "It has a bed. You and the girl take it. The boy can sleep on the pallet near the fire where it is warmest until his chest clears." Clara clutched her shawl. "And you?" Eli turned to look at her. He had removed his hat, revealing hair the color of dark soil, flattened by the brim. His eyes were unreadable. "I will sleep in the barn," he said. Clara blinked. "The barn? But this is your house. It is winter." "The tack room has a stove," Eli said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "It is warm enough. I've slept in snowbanks and cattail swamps. Mrs. Hayes." A tack room is a luxury. He paused, looking at her hands, which were still trembling slightly. You ain't ready to share a room with a man you just met, he said bluntly. And I ain't the kind to force a mare into a stall she ain't used to. You take the room. It has a lock on the inside. Use it if it helps you sleep. Clara felt a lump rise in her throat, hot and sharp. It was not the kindness that undid her. It was the dignity he was offering her. He was acknowledging her fear without mocking it. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me yet, he said, turning toward the door. I got stock to feed. There's venison in the larder and potatoes in the bin. Can you cook? Yes, Clara said, her voice gaining a fraction of strength. I can cook. Then feed them children, Eli said, and he walked out into the cold. That first meal was a religious experience. Clara found a side of venison hanging in the cold pantry, the meat dark and rich. She found a sack of onions and a bin of potatoes that still smelled of the earth. Her hands shook as she peeled the vegetables, not from cold, but from the sheer, overwhelming relief of abundance. She made a stew. She browned the meat in a heavy iron skillet with a little rendered fat, then let it simmer in the pot with water, onions, and potatoes until the broth was thick and brown. She found a tin of biscuits on a high shelf, hardtack, mostly, and soaked them in the gravy to soften them. When she set the bowls down on the wooden table, Thomas and Sarah stared at the food as if it were a mirage. Is it real? Sarah asked, her voice small. It is real, Clara said, tears pricking her eyes. Eat, baby, eat. She watched them. She did not eat her own portion immediately. She fed herself on the sight of them. She watched the color slowly return to Thomas's pale cheeks. She watched Sarah's shoulders lower from their perpetual hunch. They ate with a ferocity that broke her heart, scraping the bowls until the spoon made a harsh rasping sound against the wood. Only when they were full, their eyes heavy with the sudden rush of blood to their stomachs, did Clara finally sit and take a spoonful. The taste exploded in her mouth, salty, savory, hot. It tasted like life. Later, after she had washed the children and tucked Thomas onto a thick pile of furs near the stove and Sarah into the big feather bed in the back room, Clara sat by the fire. She listened to the wind howling outside, battering the sturdy logs. She was safe. For the first time in 6 months, she was safe. But as she looked at the heavy wooden bar she had slid across the door, she wondered about the man sleeping in the barn with the horses. She wondered what kind of man gave up his bed to a woman he had bought for the price of a promise. The days turned into a routine, a slow weaving of 2 separate lives into a single fabric. Clara took to the household work with a vengeance. It was the only currency she had to pay him back. She scrubbed the floors until her knees were bruised. She took down the heavy canvas curtains and boiled them in the washpot until they were clean of years of dust. She found his clothes, shirts with torn elbows, trousers with frayed hems, and sat by the window in the afternoon light, her needle flashing as she mended them. Eli was a ghost in his own house. He rose before the sun, drinking his coffee standing up by the stove, and was out the door before the children stirred. He spent his days with the cattle, riding the fence line, breaking ice on the watering troughs, and pitching hay. He came in only for supper. He would stomp the snow from his boots on the porch, hang his hat on the peg, and wash his hands in the basin with a bar of harsh lye soap. The meals were quiet. Eli was not a man of small talk. He ate quickly, efficiently, as if food were merely fuel, but he was not unkind. One evening, he brought in an armful of kindling, more than the box could hold. Birch, he said, setting it down. Burns hotter. Good for the morning. Another day, he came in with a small wooden top he had whittled. He set it on the table in front of Sarah without a word. When she spun it, laughing as it danced across the rough grain of the wood, Clara saw the corner of Eli's mouth twitch, the ghost of a smile that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Thomas was the bridge between them. As the boy's strength returned, he became restless. He wanted to be outside. He wanted to be where the man was. One crisp morning, Clara looked out the window to see Eli in the corral. He was grooming the big roan gelding. Thomas was standing by the fence, watching, wrapped in a coat that was 3 sizes too big for him, an old coat of Eli's that Clara had cut down and hemmed. Clara opened the window a crack to listen. "You don't approach him from the rear," Eli was saying, his voice low and patient. "A horse thinks with his eyes and his ears. If he can't see you, he thinks you are a mountain lion. You walk up to his shoulder. You put a hand on his neck. You let him know you are there." "He is so big," Thomas said, his voice filled with awe. "Size doesn't matter," Eli said. "Respect matters. You respect his strength. He respects your gentle hand. It is a trade. You understand?" "Yes, sir," Thomas said. "Don't call me sir," Eli muttered, lifting the saddle. "Makes me feel old. Call me Eli." Clara closed the window, her heart thudding a strange, uneven rhythm against her ribs. She looked down at the shirt she was mending, a flannel check that smelled faintly of him, tobacco and sage. She ran her thumb over the stitches. She was beginning to look at him. Really look at him. Not just as a savior, but as a man. She watched the way his shoulders moved when he chopped wood. She watched the way his hands, so capable of violence, were gentle when he checked the hooves of a calf. She felt a stirring deep in her belly, a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove, but she tamped it down immediately, piling heavy stones of guilt on top of it. She was a widow. She was a woman who had almost sold her body for $1. She had no right to desire, and certainly no right to desire this hard, silent stranger. The bubble of their isolation had to burst eventually. 2 weeks after they arrived, they had to go to town. The flour was low, and Eli insisted that if they were to live as man and wife, they had to do it legally. They needed the paper. The ride back to Iron Creek was tense. Clara felt exposed, like a turtle pulled from its shell. When the town came into view, she instinctively pulled Sarah closer. They went to the courthouse first. The justice of the peace, a tired man named Miller with ink-stained fingers, married them in 5 minutes. He looked at Clara, then at Eli, and cleared his throat awkwardly. "That'll be $2, Miller said. Eli paid him. He took the paper, folded it carefully, and handed it to Clara. "Keep it safe," he said. It was when they were walking to the mercantile that the trouble started. The town was small, and eyes were everywhere. Clara felt them boring into her back. Whispers trailed behind them like smoke. "That's her. Shameless. Living with him up there." They were passing the small white-clapboard church when the doors opened. Reverend Lowe stepped out. He was a thin, severe man, his face pinched as if he smelled something rotting. He saw Clara and Eli on the boardwalk. He did not lower his voice. "The path of the wicked is darkness," Lowe intoned, his voice carrying across the street. A few townsfolk stopped to watch. "They stumble, for they do not know what makes them fall." Clara froze. She looked down, her face burning. "Walk on, Clara," Eli said softly, his hand touching the small of her back. "And the adulteress will hunt for the precious life," Lowe shouted, pointing a bony finger. "You bring shame to this town. Clara Hayes, a widow who beds a killer to fill her belly, is no better than the harlots of Babylon." The words struck Clara like physical blows. Whore turned wife. That was what they were thinking. That was what she was. Eli stopped. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. He turned slowly to face the church steps. He did not draw his gun. He did not shout. He simply looked at the preacher with eyes that were flat and dead. "You got a lot to say for a man who lives on the tithes of starving widows." "Low," Eli said. His voice was not loud, but it carried perfectly in the sudden silence of the street. "Clara is my wife, before God and the law. You speak her name with disrespect again, and I will come up those steps and discuss it with you personally." The threat hung heavy in the air. The preacher's mouth snapped shut. He had seen men like Eli Boone before. He knew that they did not make idle threats. Eli turned back to Clara. "Let's go." She walked beside him, her head down, tears burning hot tracks through the dust on her face. She felt dirty. She felt marked. When they were back in the wagon, miles away from the town. Eli finally spoke. "They are sheep," he said, "bleating because they are scared. Don't you pay them no mind." "He was right," Clara whispered, staring at her hands. "I sold myself. It doesn't matter that you offered marriage. I still sold myself." "You survived," Eli said sharply. "There is no shame in survival, Clara, none." But the shame did not listen to logic. It coiled in her gut, tight and poisonous. The blizzard hit 3 nights later. It came screaming down from the north, a white wall of fury that buried the ranch in drifts 6 feet deep. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the door hinges and shaking the very foundation of the house. There was no sleeping in the barn that night. The temperature dropped so low that the nails in the walls popped with the sound of gunshots. Eli brought his bedroll inside. He laid it out on the rug in front of the fireplace, the only place in the house where the heat held against the invading cold. The children were asleep in the back room, buried under every quilt in the house. Clara sat in the rocking chair, a quilt wrapped around her legs. Eli sat on the floor, cleaning his revolver. The rhythmic snick-snick of the oiled rag on steel was the only sound in the room besides the roar of the wind. The intimacy of the moment was suffocating. They were trapped in a circle of firelight, the rest of the world erased by the storm. "Why did you never marry?" Clara asked. The question slipped out before she could stop it. Eli paused in his work. He didn't look up. He inspected the cylinder of the Colt. "Never stay in one place long enough," he said. "Because of bounty hunting?" He looked up then. The firelight danced in his dark eyes, making them look haunted. "You heard stories." "I heard you were good at it," Clara said. "I heard you were dangerous." "I was effective," Eli corrected. "There is a difference." He set the gun down on the floor cloth. He leaned back against the stone hearth, pulling his knees up. "I hunted men for 10 years, he said quietly. "Bad men, thieves, murderers. I told myself I was doing the Lord's work, cleaning up the trash." "What happened?" Clara asked. She leaned forward slightly, drawn into the orbit of his confession. "A job went wrong," Eli said. He stared into the flames. "Down in New Mexico. A boy. He had robbed a payroll wagon, killed the driver. I tracked him for 3 weeks through the desert. I caught him in a box canyon." Eli's voice grew rough, like gravel grinding together. "He was 17. Scared. He raised his gun. I didn't hesitate. I put a bullet in his chest." He looked at his hands, turning them over in the light. "When I went through his pockets, looking for the money, I found a letter, unfinished. It was to his mother. He was sending the money home. Their farm was failing. He wasn't a killer. He was just a desperate boy trying to feed his family." Clara's breath hitched. The parallel was a knife in her heart. "I looked at him," Eli whispered, "and I realized I wasn't the law. I was just another man with a gun, killing for a coin. I took the bounty money, sent it to his mother, and I rode north. I bought this land. I swore I'd never hunt a human being again." Silence stretched between them, heavy and profound. The wind battered the walls, but inside, the air was still. Clara looked at him. She saw the weight he carried, the guilt that mirrored her own. He wasn't just a hard-edged cowboy. He was a man trying to outrun his own sins. "We are a pair, aren't we?" Clara said softly. "You killed to feed yourself. I almost sold myself to feed my children. Both of us did what we had to do." Eli looked at her. His gaze was intense, stripping away her defenses. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe we are just two people trying to find a way to be decent again." Clara felt it then, an undeniable pull. It was not just gratitude. It was a spark of desire, fierce and sudden. She wanted to reach out and touch the scar on his jaw. She wanted to feel the roughness of his hand against her cheek. She saw the same look in his eyes. His gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. The air between them crackled, hotter than the fire. But then the shame rose up, the preacher's voice echoing in her mind. Whore-turned wife. She was damaged goods. She had no right to touch a man who was trying to be clean. She pulled the quilt tighter around herself, breaking the moment. "It's late," she said, her voice trembling. The fire is dying down. Eli blinked, the mask sliding back into place. He nodded, turning back to the fire. Get some sleep, Clara, he said. The storm will break by morning. Clara stood and retreated to her room. She locked the door, not to keep him out, but to keep herself in. She lay in the dark, listening to the wind, and for the first time, she realized that the most dangerous thing on the ranch was not the cold, nor the wolves, nor the past. It was the man sleeping on the floor on the other side of the door, and the way he made her want to believe in forgiveness. The winter did not surrender easily. It retreated by inches, fighting a slow, retreating war against the rising sun. But by April, the white drifts that had choked the valley began to slump into gray, weeping mounds. The silence of the deep freeze was replaced by the constant, musical dripping of meltwater and the roar of the creek swelling against its banks. The earth emerged from beneath the snow, muddy and smelling of rot and rebirth. Clara Hayes stood in the patch of ground behind the cabin, her boots caked in thick, black mud. The air was cool, but it held the promise of warmth, a gentle caress against her cheek that felt like a pardon after the sentencing of winter. She was turning the soil, preparing the garden. It was back-breaking work, driving the spade into the heavy, wet earth. But Clara welcomed it. It felt good to be the one shaping the land, rather than just surviving it. Thomas was beside her, wrestling with a bucket of stones they had cleared from the plot. The boy had changed. The hollows in his cheeks had filled out. His skin was brown from the wind and sun, and the wheezing rattle in his chest had faded into a memory. He wore a miniature version of Eli's hat, pulled low over his eyes, and he worked with a solemn intensity that mimicked the man he shadowed. "Is this deep enough, Mama?" Thomas asked, pointing to a furrow he had dug. Clara wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a streak of dirt. "It is perfect. Thomas, the potatoes will be happy there." She looked toward the corral. Eli was there, as he always was, mending a section of rail that the snow load had cracked. He was working methodically, his movements efficient and strong. He paused, feeling her gaze, and tipped his head in a silent acknowledgement before returning to his task. They had survived the winter. They had existed in the small cabin like bears in a den, circling each other with wariness that had slowly, imperceptibly, softened into a domestic rhythm. They were not quite a family, but they were no longer strangers. The shift was most evident with the children. Sarah, 4 years old and fearless, had decided that Eli Boone was not a terrifying ex-bounty hunter, but a large, warm piece of furniture that could be climbed. That evening, after a supper of rabbit stew and cornbread, the change manifested in a way that stopped Clara's heart. Eli was sitting in the high-backed wooden chair near the hearth, whittling a new latch for the root cellar. Sarah stood behind him on the rungs of his chair, her small hands busy in his dark, collar-length hair. Clara sat at the table, mending a sock, watching them out of the corner of her eye. She expected Eli to brush the girl away, to retreat into his solitary stoicism. Instead, he held his head perfectly still. "You got tangles," Sarah announced, tugging on a lock of hair with less gentleness than a barber would employ. "Is that a fact?" Eli grunted, blowing wood shavings off the latch. "Yes, I am fixing them. I am making you pretty." Clara stifled a smile, burying her face in her sewing. "I ain't sure pretty is something I aim for. Little bit," Eli said dryly. "Hush," Sarah commanded. She began to braid a section of his hair near his temple, her small fingers clumsy but determined. She tied it off with a piece of yarn she had scavenged from Clara's basket. "There," Sarah said, patting his shoulder with satisfaction. "Now you look like a chief. Look, Pa." The word hung in the room, sudden and heavy. Sarah didn't notice. She jumped down from the chair and ran to fetch her rag doll. But Clara froze, the needle hovering over the wool sock. Thomas looked up from the floor where he was playing with the wooden horse Eli had carved. Silence stretched, thick and awkward. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at Eli, expecting anger, or perhaps the cold withdrawal that happened whenever they got too close to the truth of their arrangement. Eli sat motionless. He slowly reached up and touched the clumsy little braid hanging by his ear. He didn't tear it out. "I am sorry," Clara said, her voice breathless. She forgets. She doesn't mean any disrespect to your name or station." Eli turned in the chair to look at her. The firelight softened the harsh planes of his face, casting deep shadows in the hollows of his eyes. There was no anger there. Instead, there was a profound, aching sadness that softened into something gentle. "She is 4 years old. Clara," Eli said quietly. "She calls the cat dog half the time. Don't scold her." "But I don't want you to think I am teaching them to overstep," Clara stammered. Eli looked at Sarah, who was humming to her doll by the wood box. A small, crooked smile touched his lips. A rare thing, like a wildflower blooming on granite. "I have been called a lot of things in my life," Eli said. "Killer, tracker, bastard. Pa is the first one that didn't make me want to reach for my gun." He stood up, leaving the braid in his hair, and went to check the stove. Clara watched him, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a dangerous warmth. It was the heat of hope. The spring deepened, and with it, the ranch demanded more. The days grew longer, stretching the light well into the evening. One morning, Clara woke before the children. The sun was just cresting the peaks, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and pink. She dressed quietly and went out to the porch to draw water from the rain barrel. The rhythmic thwack of an axe splitting wood echoed from behind the cabin. Clara walked around the corner of the house, the bucket in her hand. She stopped. Eli was at the wood pile. He had shed his coat and his flannel shirt, working only in his trousers and suspenders. His skin was tanned from years of exposure, his muscles cording and bunching with every swing of the heavy splitting maul. Sweat glistened on his shoulders, catching the morning light. But it was not his strength that held Clara captive. It was the map of violence written on his flesh, across his broad back. A spider web of scars told the story of his life. There was the puckered, round crater of an old bullet wound near his shoulder blade. There were long, thin white lines that looked like knife slashes. And lower, across his ribs, the jagged, ugly mark of what might have been a steer's horn or a fall from a horse on rocky ground. He was a tapestry of survival. Clara knew she should turn away. A decent woman did not stare at a half-naked man, even if he was her husband by law. But she could not move. She watched the way his back flexed as he brought the axe down, the raw power of him. For the first time since Samuel died, perhaps for the first time in her life, Clara felt a surge of pure, unadulterated want. It was not the safe, warm affection she was beginning to feel for his kindness. This was carnal. It was a physical pull that started in her stomach and tightened her throat. She wanted to step forward and trace those scars with her fingertips. She wanted to know the texture of that damaged skin. Eli swung the axe, splitting a round of pine with a loud crack. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow with his forearm. He sensed her then, the instinct of the hunter. He turned sharply, the axe still in his hand. When he saw her, he didn't cover himself. He simply stood there, his chest heaving slightly from the exertion. His eyes locked onto hers across the yard. Clara felt the blush rise from her neck to her hairline, hot and revealing. She tightened her grip on the bucket handle until her knuckles turned white. "Morning," Eli said. His voice was rough with morning gravel. "Morning," Clara managed to whisper. I was just getting water." "Bucket's empty," Eli noted. His eyes dropped to the bucket, then traveled slowly back up to her face. There was a heat in his gaze that matched her own, a recognition of the tension that had been winding tighter between them with every passing week. "I should go," Clara said, fleeing the moment. She turned and hurried back to the safety of the kitchen, her heart beating like a trapped bird. The desire might have remained a secret, buried under layers of propriety and fear, had it not been for the wire. 3 days later, Eli was out fencing the south pasture. He came in late for supper, moving stiffly. When he washed his hands at the basin, Clara noticed a dark, angry gash on his left forearm. "You're hurt," she said, setting a platter of biscuits on the table. "Barbed wire." Eli grunted, drying his hands. "Snapped back on me. Rusted. It's nothing. Let me clean it," Clara insisted. "I washed it. It'll heal. Always does." He ate his supper in silence, but Clara noticed he didn't finish his stew. He went to the barn early, and when he came back to sleep on his pallet by the fire, he moved with a heaviness that worried her. By the next evening, the nothing had become something. Eli came in from the rain, shivering so violently his teeth chattered. His face was gray, his eyes glassy and fever-bright. He stumbled toward the chair and collapsed into it. Clara dropped the broom she was holding. She rushed to him, pressing the back of her hand to his forehead. He was burning up. "Thomas, get the blankets from the bed," she ordered, her voice sharp with fear. "Sarah, bring me the whiskey and the clean rags." "I'm fine," Eli mumbled, trying to stand up. "Just a chill. Sit down." "Eli Boone," Clara commanded, pushing him back by his shoulders. "You are burning with fever. Let me see the arm." He didn't have the strength to fight her. She rolled up his sleeve. The cut from the wire was ugly, swollen, red, and oozing yellow pus. Red streaks were beginning to crawl up his arm toward his elbow. Blood poisoning, terror, cold and absolute, washed over Clara. She had seen men die of less in the mining camps. "We have to draw the poison," she said. For the next 2 days, the cabin became a sick room. Clara sent the children to sleep in the big bed while she stayed by the fire with Eli. She made poultices of bread and milk, of onion and herbs, binding them tight against the wound. She forced willow bark tea down his throat to break the fever. She bathed him. It was an intimacy she had not prepared for. She stripped him of his sweat-soaked shirt to wash his chest with cool water. She felt the heat radiating off him like a furnace. She ran the wet cloth over the scars she had admired from a distance, learning the topography of his pain with her hands. "In his delirium," Eli muttered. He spoke of the names she didn't know: Jasper, Cole, a woman named May. He spoke of blood and snow. He apologized to ghosts. Clara sat on the floor beside him, holding his hand, anchoring him to the living world. She wiped his brow, whispering soft nonsense to soothe him. "I am here, Eli, I am here. You are safe." On the third night, the fever broke. Clara had fallen asleep sitting up, her head resting on the edge of his pallet. She woke to the feeling of a hand on her hair. She jerked awake. The fire had burned down to embers. The room was dim. Eli was looking at her. His eyes were clear, no longer glazed with fever, though he looked exhausted and hollowed out. "Clara," he rasped. "You're awake," she breathed, reaching for the cup of water. "Here, drink." He drank greedily, then fell back against the pillow she had made for him. He looked at her hand, which was still resting on his arm. "You stayed," he said. It was a statement of wonder. "Where else would I go?" Clara asked softly. "Most people run when the sickness takes a man," Eli said, "or when the ghosts come out. I reckon I was talking." "You were," Clara admitted. "But I didn't listen to the words. I just listened to the voice." Eli turned his hand over, interlacing his fingers with hers. His grip was weak, but deliberate. "Thank you for saving my hide. Again." "You saved us first," Clara said. "I am just paying the debt." "No," Eli said, shaking his head slightly. "This ain't debt. Clara, you deserve better than this. Better than a nursemaid to a washed-up hunter with blood on his hands." "I don't see blood," Clara said fiercely. "I see the man who feeds my children. I see the man who gave up his bed. I see the man who let my daughter braid his hair." She leaned closer, the distance between them vanishing. The air in the room shifted, heavy with the scent of wood smoke and the raw, fragile honesty of the moment. "I see a good man. Eli." Eli looked at her, his eyes searching her face. "I ain't good, Clara, but I want to be. God help me. When I look at you, I want to be." The confession hung between them. Clara didn't think. She didn't calculate. She simply followed the pull that had been plaguing her for weeks. She leaned down and pressed her lips to his. It was a hesitant kiss, soft, tasting of fever and water. Her hand came up to cup his jaw, the stubble rough against her palm. For a heartbeat, Eli froze. Then, with a low groan in his throat, he kissed her back. His hand came up to grip the back of her neck, pulling her down. The kiss deepened, becoming desperate, a release of months of solitude and fear. Clara felt a jolt of electricity that made her toes curl. She opened to him, wanting to crawl inside his skin, to erase the past for both of them. Then, Eli pulled away. He broke the kiss, turning his head to the side, his chest heaving. He released her neck, his hand trembling as it fell back to the quilt. "I can't," he whispered. Clara pulled back, stung, confusion and hurt flooding her face. "Eli, I can't take this," he said, his voice rough. "Not like this, not while I'm weak, not while you're grateful." He looked at her, his eyes dark with a restraint that looked painful. "If we do this, Clara, if we cross this line, there ain't no going back. I won't make you a wife in truth just because you feel you owe me a life." "It isn't debt," Clara insisted, her voice shaking. "Maybe," Eli said, "but I need to be sure, and you need to be sure. I won't have you waking up tomorrow regretting that you laid with the hired help." He was protecting her. Even now, he was protecting her honor against his own desire. Clara stood up, her legs unsteady. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders. "I don't regret you, Eli Boone, and I am not confused." She walked to her room, her heart pounding with a mixture of rejection and a strange, soaring triumph. He wanted her. She knew it now, and he respected her enough to wait. The rejection, paradoxically, emboldened her. In the days that followed, as Eli regained his strength, Clara moved with a new purpose. She was done with the gray wool dress she had worn since leaving the mining camp, the dress of the starving widow. She went to the trunk at the foot of her bed. Inside, she had a length of blue calico fabric she had bought years ago, intending to make curtains. She took it out. It was the color of the summer sky, bright and hopeful. She began to sew. She sat by the window in the evenings, her needle flashing in the lamplight. She cut the fabric to fit her form, pulling it in at the waist, letting the skirt flare. She wasn't sewing curtains. She was sewing a declaration. She was sewing a wedding dress. Though she was already married, she wanted to look like a woman who was loved. She wanted to look like a wife. Eli watched her sew, his eyes lingering on the blue fabric, but he said nothing. The tension in the cabin was a taut wire, humming with anticipation. By late May, the dress was finished, but before she could wear it for him, reality intruded. The supplies were low again. The coffee tin was empty, and they needed seed corn for the planting. They had to go to Iron Creek. The trip to town felt different this time. The snow was gone, replaced by wildflowers in the meadows. The air was sweet. Clara wore her old dress, saving the blue one, but she wore her head high. She sat next to Eli on the wagon seat, not huddled away, but upright. Iron Creek was busy with the spring trade. Wagons clogged the main street. Clara and Eli went about their business efficiently. They loaded the wagon with flour, sugar, coffee, and a sack of seed corn. They were coming out of the mercantile, Eli carrying a crate of nails, when a voice cut through the noise of the street like a cracking whip. "Well, I'll be damned. If it isn't the grieving widow." Clara froze on the boardwalk. She knew that voice. It was a voice from a past she had tried to bury, slick, oily, and laced with an entitlement that made her skin crawl. She turned slowly. Standing near the hitching post, leaning against a polished black carriage, was Harlan McCrae. Harlan had been a foreman at the mine before he moved into cattle speculation. He was a handsome man in a soft, doughy way, dressed in a suit that cost more than Eli's ranch. He had pursued Clara relentlessly before she married Samuel, and he had never taken her rejection well. "Harlan," Clara said, her voice steady though her stomach churned. Harlan pushed off the carriage and walked toward them. He ignored Eli completely, his eyes raking over Clara with a familiar, Insolent ownership. "I heard you'd run off," Harlan said, smiling a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "People said you went wild, took up with a drifter to pay your bills." "I remarried." "Harlan," Clara said coldly. "This is my husband, Eli Boone." Harlan finally looked at Eli. He looked at the worn duster, the scarred boots, the gun at his hip. He sneered. "Husband?" Harlan laughed. "That's a polite word for it. I hear you were selling wares on the street corner when he picked you up. Clara, seems you finally found your price. I'm hurt. I would have paid double." The insult hung in the air, foul and poisonous. Eli set the crate of nails down on the boardwalk. He did it slowly, deliberately. He straightened up, towering over Harlan. "You want to apologize to my wife," Eli said. His voice was low, the dangerous rumble of a landslide beginning to slide. Harlan didn't back down. He had money now, and money made men foolishly brave. "Wife," Harlan spat. "It's a sham. Boone, everyone knows it. A marriage of convenience to hide a whore's shame. Samuel Hayes was a good man. He's rolling in his grave seeing his woman shack up with a bounty hunter." Harlan turned back to Clara. "You listen to me. Clara, you annul this farce. You come back to town. I can set you up. Proper. You don't belong in a shack with a killer." "I am where I belong," Clara said, stepping closer to Eli. "And you are not welcome to speak to me." Harlan's face darkened. "You think this is over? I hold the note on half the businesses in this town now. Clara." "I have the preacher's ear. I won't let you parade this mockery around." Eli stepped forward, entering Harlan's personal space. Harlan flinched, his hand twitching toward his coat pocket, but he saw the look in Eli's eyes and froze. "McCrae," Eli said softly, "I stopped killing men a long time ago, but I ain't forgotten how. You stay away from her. You keep her name out of your mouth, or I will come find you, and I won't be bringing a lawyer." Eli didn't wait for a response. He took Clara's elbow. "Let's go." They walked to the wagon, leaving Harlan fuming on the boardwalk, his face a mask of humiliated rage. As they rode out of town, the spring air felt colder. The peace of the last few weeks had been shattered. Clara looked at Eli's profile. His jaw was set so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. "He won't stop," Clara whispered. "I know him. He is a spiteful man. He thinks he owns things just because he wants them." "Let him try," Eli said, staring at the road ahead. "I fought worse than a dandy in a silk suit." But as Clara looked back at the town receding in the distance, she felt a shadow fall over the bright blue promise of her new dress. The past had found them, and it was not going to let them be. The wagon wheels churned through the mud of the road leading away from Iron Creek. The sound, a wet, sucking rhythm that filled the heavy silence between them. The encounter with Harlan McCrae hung over the buckboard like a thunderhead, dark and electric. Eli drove with his eyes fixed on the horizon, his jaw set in a line of granite. Clara sat beside him, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her fingers were white. She could still feel McCrae's eyes on her, that slithering, possessive gaze that made her feel naked and dirty, even beneath her layers of wool and cotton. "He won't stop," Clara said. Her voice was low, barely audible over the creak of the harness, but it cut through the quiet. Eli did not look at her. "I told you, I will handle him." "You don't understand," Clara said, turning to look at his profile. "It is not just that he is a bitter man. Eli, it is personal. It has always been personal." Eli flicked the reins, urging the mules up a rise. "Tell me." Clara took a breath, inhaling the scent of damp earth and pine. She had never spoken of this to anyone, not even Samuel. It was a shame she had carried in the dark corners of her heart, a secret burden. "Before I married Samuel," she began, staring at the mule's ears. "Harlan came to my father's house. He was just a foreman then, but he was ambitious. He brought gifts, lace, ribbon. He told my father he wanted to court me." She paused, swallowing the bile that rose in her throat. "I didn't like him. He had cold eyes, like a snake sunning itself on a rock. I told him no. I told him I was promised to Samuel, even though Samuel had not yet asked me properly. Harlan, He didn't take it well. Eli remained silent, but Clara saw his gloved hands tighten on the leather ribbons. "He caught me alone one evening," Clara whispered. "By the creek. He grabbed me. He said that Samuel was a weak man, a dirt scratcher, and that I needed a man who could take what he wanted. He tried to force me down into the grass." The wagon lurched over a rut. Eli's head snapped toward her, his eyes blazing with a sudden, terrifying intensity. "He touched you?" "I fought him," Clara said, her voice gaining a tremble of remembered fear. "I scratched his face. I screamed. A neighbor heard and came running. Harlan ran off. He told everyone I had led him on, that I was a tease, but he stopped coming around." She looked down at her hands. "Or so I thought. Then Samuel and I married. We were happy. Eli, we were poor, but we were happy. Then the debt started. Small things at first, but suddenly, the company store wouldn't extend credit. The landlord raised the rent. Samuel couldn't understand it. He worked so hard, but we were drowning." Clara looked at Eli, tears pooling in her eyes. Then the job at the glory hole opened up. It was dangerous work. Everyone knew the timbering was bad in that shaft, but the pay was double. Samuel didn't want to take it. He was scared. But someone called in a note he owed, a debt from years ago. She wiped a tear from her cheek. "I think it was Harlan. I think he bought Samuel's debt just to force him into that mine. He knew the shaft would collapse eventually. He sent my husband to his death so he could step in and pick up the pieces." Eli pulled the wagon to a halt. The sudden stop threw Clara forward slightly. The mules huffed, confused by the interruption. The wind rustled through the lodgepole pines, a lonely, whispering sound. Eli sat frozen, staring at nothing. His face had gone pale beneath his tan. "Samuel Hayes," Eli said, his voice sounding strange, hollow. "Who did he owe the money to originally, before Harlan got his hands on it?" Clara frowned, confused by the question. I don't know for certain. Samuel never liked to worry me with money, but I remember a name on a letter once, a man from Denver. Vance? Cyrus Vance?" Eli closed his eyes. A shudder went through his massive frame, as if he had been struck by a physical blow. He let out a breath that was half-groan, half-curse. "Cyrus Vance," Eli repeated. "You knew him?" Clara asked. Eli turned to her. The look in his eyes was one of profound, haunted devastation. "I killed him." Clara stared at him, her mouth parting slightly. "What?" 3 years ago, Eli said, his voice flat and mechanical. "Vance was a loan shark, a bad one. He beat a shopkeeper to death in Cheyenne over a $50 dispute. The family put a bounty on him. I tracked him to a hotel in Denver." Eli looked at his hands, the leather gloves creaking as he made a fist. "He drew on me. I put 2 bullets in his chest. I collected the bounty and rode on." He looked back at Clara, his eyes pleading for understanding, or perhaps forgiveness. When a man like Vance dies, his estate, his ledger, gets sold off to the highest bidder. If Samuel owed Vance money, and I killed Vance, then the debt was sold. Clara finished, the horror dawning on her. "And Harlan bought it." "I handed your husband to him," Eli whispered. "I pulled the trigger in Denver, and the bullet traveled 3 years and 500 miles and killed Samuel Hayes in a mine shaft." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a universe that felt cruel, a tapestry woven by a madman. They sat there, 2 people battered by the world, realizing that their tragedies were not separate. They were knotted together, a tangled mess of blood and gold and bad luck. Clara looked at this man, this hard, scarred man who had saved her children from starvation. She thought she should be angry. She thought she should hate him for his part in the chain of events that widowed her. But she looked at his face, etched with guilt and sorrow, and she felt only a profound sense of fate. "We are cursed," Clara whispered. "No," Eli said, his voice hardening again. "Not cursed, targeted. Harlan McRae thinks he can play God with our lives. He thinks he can buy men and kill men and take women like cattle." Eli grabbed the reins again. The leather snapped. "Yeah!" The wagon lurched forward, faster this time, Eli drove with a new fury. He wasn't driving away from the past anymore. He was driving toward a reckoning. 2 days later, the reckoning arrived, though not in the way Clara expected. Eli had ridden into Iron Creek alone. He told Clara he needed to speak to the blacksmith about a new plowshare, but Clara saw the set of his shoulders and knew he was lying. He was going to find Harland. She waited at the ranch, pacing the floorboards until the wood was worn smooth. She prayed. She watched the road. In town, the Red Dog Saloon was quiet for a Tuesday afternoon. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light cutting through the smoke. Harland McCrae sat at a poker table near the back, flanked by 2 men who looked like they earned their wages with their knuckles rather than their wits. When the batwing doors swung open, the light from the street momentarily blinded the patrons. Then Eli Boone stepped inside. He didn't look like a rancher today. He wore his long canvas duster, swept back behind his hip. His hat was pulled low. He walked to the bar, ordered a whiskey, and didn't drink it. He turned slowly, leaning his back against the polished wood of the bar, and looked directly at Harland. "Afternoon, McCrae," Eli said. His voice was conversational, almost pleasant, which made it terrifying. Harland looked up from his cards. He smiled, a smug, oily expression. "Well, look who it is, the squatter. Come to surrender your claim on the lady?" "I came to talk about Cyrus Vance," Eli said. The smile vanished from Harland's face. He tossed his cards onto the table. "I don't know who that is." "I think you do," Eli said, pushing off the bar and walking toward the table. "I think you bought a dead man's book. I think you used a dead man's debt to murder a good man." Harland stood up. His 2 hired men stood with him, hands hovering near their belts. "You are talking nonsense. Boone!" Harland spat. "And you are trespassing on my patience. Boys, throw this trash in the street." The man on Harland's right, a hulking brute with a broken nose, lunged forward. He was fast for a big man, reaching for the collar of Eli's coat. Eli didn't draw his gun. He stepped inside the man's guard, moving with a fluid, vicious speed. He drove his fist into the man's solar plexus, doubling him over, then brought his knee up into the man's face with a sickening crunch of cartilage. The brute dropped like a stone. The second man hesitated, his hand going for his pistol. "Don't!" Eli warned. The man froze. Eli turned his attention to Harland. Harland McCrae was not a warrior. He was a manipulator. Seeing his protection crumpled on the floor, he backed away, knocking over his chair. "Now, Boone, listen," Harland stammered, raising his hands. "We can discuss this. I have money. I can write you a check." "You think money fixes everything," Eli said, stalking forward. "You think money bought you the right to touch her, to ruin her." Eli grabbed Harland by the lapels of his expensive suit and slammed him against the wall. A picture frame shattered, raining glass onto the floor. "You are going to listen to me," Eli growled, his face inches from Harland's. "Clara Hayes is my wife. If you say her name again, if you look at her again, if you so much as dream about her, I will finish what I started with Cyrus Vance. Do you understand? You can't threaten me." Harland shrieked, though his eyes were wide with terror. "I am a respected man." Eli pulled back a fist and drove it into Harland's face. It wasn't a punch meant to kill. It was a punch meant to instruct. Harland's head snapped back, blood spraying from his lip. Eli hit him again, and again. He beat him until Harland slumped to the floor, a whimpering, bloody heap of silk and bruised flesh. Eli stood over him, breathing hard. He flexed his right hand. His knuckles were split and bleeding. He looked around the saloon. The bartender was frozen, polishing a glass. The few patrons were staring at the floor, terrified to make eye contact. "He fell," Eli said to the room. He turned and walked out into the sunlight. It was dark when Eli returned to the ranch. Clara met him on the porch, holding a lantern. She saw his face first, stoic, impassive. Then she saw his hands. They were wrapped in his handkerchief, dark with dried blood. "Eli." She set the lantern down and reached for him. "It ain't mine," Eli said wearily. "Mostly. He walked into the house and sank into his chair by the fire. He looked old tonight. The weight of the violence hung on him like a wet coat. Clara fetched a bowl of warm water and a cloth. She knelt beside him, unwrapping his hands. The knuckles were raw, the skin broken. She dipped the cloth and began to clean them, her touch feather-light. "Harlan?" she asked softly. "He will live," Eli said, "but he won't be smiling for a while." Clara looked at the bruises on his hands. These were the hands that chopped her wood, the hands that carved toys for her children, the hands that had beaten a man bloody to defend her honor. She felt a crack in the wall she had built around her heart. It wasn't a small fissure. It was a dam breaking. "You fought for me," she whispered. "I would kill for you," Eli said simply. He looked at her, his eyes dark and unguarded. "I told you, I take care of what is mine." What is mine? The words shivered through her. She didn't feel owned. She felt claimed. She felt cherished. "I don't want you to sleep in the barn anymore," Clara said. Her voice was steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "And I don't want you sleeping on the floor." Eli went still. "Clara." "No," she interrupted. "No more waiting. No more ghosts. Eli, just us." She stood up and pulled him to his feet. He went willingly, following her not to the bedroom, but to the rug before the fire, where the heat was strongest. She reached up and unbuttoned his shirt. Her fingers brushed the scars on his chest, the map of his pain. She kissed the jagged line of white tissue over his ribs. Eli let out a shuddering breath. His hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones. "Are you sure?" "I am sure," she breathed. He kissed her then, and it wasn't like the first time. I wasn't hesitant. It was a collision. It was hunger and desperation and a fierce, consuming need. They sank to the floor, the firelight painting their skin in gold and shadow. Clara had been a wife before, but this was different. With Samuel, it had been gentle, sweet. With Eli, it was elemental. It was a storm. When he entered her, she buried her face in the curve of his neck to stifle her cry, her hands gripping his broad shoulders. She felt him tremble, this mountain of a man, shaking with the force of his restraint, trying to be gentle with her when she knew he wanted to devour her. "Eli?" She moaned against his skin. "Eli." They moved together in the firelight, two broken pieces of the world fitting together to make something whole. It was an act of defiance against the cold, against the town, against the death that stalked them. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the buffalo robe. The fire popped and hissed. Clara lay with her head on Eli's chest, listening to the slow, powerful thud of his heart. She felt a tear slide down the bridge of her nose and land on his skin. Then another. Eli stiffened. "Did I hurt you?" "No," Clara choked out. "No." "Then why are you crying?" "Because," Clara whispered, the sob catching in her throat. "I didn't think I would ever feel this again. I didn't think I was allowed to be wanted. I thought I was just a mouth to feed, a problem to be solved." Eli's arm tightened around her, pulling her closer. He kissed the top of her head. "You ain't a problem, Clara," he rumbled. "You are the only good thing that has happened to me in 20 years. She wept then, cleansing tears that washed away the shame of the winter, the humiliation of the butcher shop, the cold nights in the shack. She was not a widow. She was not a beggar. She was Eli Boone's wife. But happiness in Iron Creek was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the stones of judgment. Harlan McCrae did not take his beating in silence. He vanished from the public eye to nurse his wounds. But his money continued to work. He poured poison into the ears of the town. He spoke to the women's auxiliary. He spoke to the church elders. The following Saturday, Clara and Eli had to go to market. They needed grain for the horses. They rode into town side by side on the wagon seat. Clara wore her blue dress. She felt armored in it, armored in Eli's love. But the town felt different. The silence was sharper. People stopped on the boardwalks to watch them pass, their faces hard and closed. They walked to the general store. As Clara reached for the door handle, It opened from the inside. Mrs. Gable, the mayor's wife, stepped out. She was a large woman who wore her piety like a shield. Clara stepped back to let her pass. "Good morning, Mrs. Gable." Mrs. Gable looked at Clara. She looked at the blue dress. She looked at Eli standing a few paces behind. Then, with a look of pure, distilled hatred, she spat. The glob of spittle landed on the hem of Clara's blue skirt, a dark, ugly stain on the bright fabric. The street went silent. Clara stood frozen, staring at the spot. The shock was so physical it felt like a slap. Eli moved. It was a blur of motion. He stepped forward, his hand going to his gun belt, not to draw, but resting there with a lethal intent. His face was a mask of fury. "You apologize," Eli snarled, his voice shaking the storefront windows. "Mrs." Gable turned pale, backing up against the wall. "I will not. She is a harlot, living in sin with a murderer. The Reverend told us everything." Eli, "No," Clara said, grabbing his arm. She could feel the tension in his muscles, vibrating like a plucked wire. "Don't. She isn't worth it." "She spit on you," Eli said, his eyes not leaving the woman's face. "Let's go," Clara pleaded. "Please, Eli, for the children, don't make a scene." Eli looked at the terrified woman, then at the gathering crowd. He saw the judgment in their eyes. The butcher, the baker, the people Clara had known for years. They were all strangers now. He put his arm around Clara, shielding her with his body, and walked her back to the wagon. He lifted her up, his touch gentle despite his rage. They rode out of town without buying the grain. The spit dried on Clara's dress, a badge of their exile. That night, the mood in the cabin was somber. The children sensed it, eating their supper in quiet confusion. After the children were asleep, Eli stood by the window, looking out into the darkness. "We can leave," he said suddenly. Clara looked up from her mending. "What?" "We can pack the wagon," Eli said, turning to face her. "Head west, Oregon, California. There are places where no one knows us, where the name McCrae means nothing. I have some gold put away, enough to start over." He looked desperate. He wanted to protect her, and he knew his fists and his gun couldn't fight whispers. Clara looked at the cabin. She looked at the fire she had built. She looked at the garden where the potato shoots were just breaking the soil. She thought of the road, the hunger, the uncertainty. "No," Clara said. "Clara, they won't stop," Eli argued. "They will bleed us dry with their hate. I won't have you treated like a leper." "I am done running." "Eli," Clara said, standing up. She walked to him and placed her hands on his chest. "I ran from poverty. I ran from the cold. I will not run from a bitter man and a town of hypocrites. This is our home. We built this. We earned this." She looked up at him, her eyes fierce. "Let them talk. Let them spit. We have the land. We have each other. I will not give Harlan McCrae the satisfaction of seeing my back." Eli covered her hands with his. He sighed, a sound of resignation and immense pride. "You are a stubborn woman." "Clara Boone." "I am a survivor," she corrected, but the cost of staying was high. The next afternoon, Thomas came home from fishing in the creek. He was quiet, dragging his feet. He didn't run to show Eli his catch. Clara found him sitting on the porch steps, staring at his boots. "Thomas?" she asked, sitting beside him. "What's wrong?" The boy didn't look up. He picked at a loose splinter in the wood. "Mama?" he asked, his voice small and trembling. "Are you a bad woman?" Clara felt her heart stop. "Why would you ask that?" "Some boys were by the bridge," Thomas whispered. "They threw rocks at me. They said you were a whore. They said Eli bought you." He looked up at her, tears tracking through the dirt on his face. "What is a whore, Mama?" Clara pulled him into her arms, burying her face in his neck so he wouldn't see her own tears. She held him tight, rocking him back and forth. How could she explain the cruelty of the world to a 7-year-old? How could she explain that she had almost done the unthinkable to save his life? She pulled back and held his face in her hands. "Thomas, look at me." she said firmly. People say mean things when they are angry or scared. But you know me. You know I love you. You know I love Sarah. You know Eli takes care of us. I know. Thomas sniffed. A bad woman is someone who hurts people. Clara said. Someone who lies and steals. Have I ever done those things? No, Mama. Then you listen to me, not them. Clara said fiercely. We are a family, and we are good people. We are surviving, and there is no shame in that. Do you understand? Thomas nodded, wiping his nose on his sleeve. Clara kissed his forehead. Go wash up for supper. As he ran inside, Clara remained on the porch. She looked toward the horizon, where the sun was setting in a blaze of red. She had told Eli she wouldn't run, and she meant it. But as the shadows lengthened, she knew that Harlan McCrae would not be satisfied with insults and spit. He had failed to shame them into leaving. Now, he would try to burn them out. Clara reached into her apron pocket and touched the cold steel of the small derringer Eli had given her that morning. Keep it close, he had said. She stared at the darkening road. She was ready. The moon was buried behind a shroud of heavy, low-hanging clouds, leaving the valley in a suffocating darkness. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and impending rain, the kind of stillness that makes the hair on a dog's neck stand on end. Inside the cabin, the silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic ticking of the mantel clock and the soft breathing of the children in the back room. Clara lay awake. Beside her, Eli breathed deeply, but she knew the rhythm of his sleep. And this was not it. He was awake too, staring up at the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling, his body tense beneath the quilt. He is out there, Clara whispered into the dark. It wasn't a question. No, Eli rumbled, his voice vibrating against her shoulder. He ain't that brave. He's a man who fights with whispers and lawyers. Clara, not with his hands. But Eli was wrong. Desperation makes wolves of sheep. And Harlan McCrae was a man whose world was crumbling. His pride had been shattered in the saloon. His influence was waning as the town grew weary of his vendetta. And his obsession with Clara had curdled into a poisonous madness. The sound came from the barn, a dull thud, like a heavy boot against wood, followed by the high-pitched whinny of the roan gelding. Eli was out of bed before the sound had finished echoing. He pulled on his trousers and boots in the dark, his movements silent and practiced. He reached for the gun belt hanging on the bedpost, buckling it around his waist with a sharp clack of leather. Stay here, he commanded, his voice low. Bar the door. Eli, bar the door. Clara. He slipped out into the night, the heavy oak door closing behind him with a finality that made Clara's heart seize. She didn't bar it. Instead, she moved to the corner where Samuel's old Winchester rifle leaned against the wall. She checked the chamber, loaded, and wrapped a shawl around her nightdress. She moved to the window, peering into the black void of the yard. A lantern flickered to life in the barn, casting long, jagged shadows through the gaps in the siding. Eli moved across the yard like a ghost. The wind had picked up, masking the sound of his approach. He reached the barn door, which was slightly ajar. He drew his Colt, holding it close to his body, and stepped into the dim yellow light. The barn smelled of hay and nervous animals. The horses were pacing in their stalls, their eyes rolling white in the gloom. Standing in the center of the threshing floor was Harlan McCrae. He held a lantern in one hand and a heavy branding iron in the other. He was drunk. Eli could smell the whiskey from 10 paces away, but his eyes were focused with a maniacal clarity. I knew you'd come, Harlan said, his voice slurring slightly. Couldn't resist the cry of your beasts. Get out, Harlan, Eli said, leveling the pistol. This is the last time I tell you. Harlan laughed, a wet, jagged sound. He set the lantern on a hay bale, a dangerous, reckless move. Oh, I'm leaving. Boone, but I ain't leaving alone. I'm taking her, and I'm taking the boy. Samuel's boy belongs to a decent upbringing, not to be raised by a butcher like you. You touch them, and you die, Eli said. The coldness in his voice dropped the temperature in the barn. Will I? Harlan sneered. He reached into his coat pocket. Eli tensed, his finger tightening on the trigger, but Harlan didn't pull a gun. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I did some digging," Harlan said, waving the paper. "Send a telegram to Denver. Seems there's still a warrant out for the man who killed Cyrus Vance. Not a bounty, a warrant for murder. The law wants you to hang Boone. And I have the sheriff waiting down the road. All I have to do is signal him." Harlan took a step forward, his face twisting into a mask of triumph. "So here is the deal. You saddle a horse and you ride. You leave her. You leave the ranch. And I burn this paper. If you stay, you hang, and she watches." Eli looked at the paper. He looked at Harlan's smug, sweating face, the rage that had been simmering in his gut for weeks, the rage he had suppressed for the sake of Clara and the children, boiled over. He holstered the gun. Harlan blinked, confused. "What are you—" Eli didn't speak. He charged. He covered the distance between them in 2 strides. Harlan swung the branding iron, a clumsy, desperate arc. Eli ducked under it, the iron whistling over his head, and drove his shoulder into Harlan's midsection. They crashed into the stall door, splintering the wood. Harlan went down with a grunt, Eli on top of him. The lantern wobbled on the hay bale but didn't fall. It was not a fight. It was an execution. Eli's fists were pistons. He struck Harlan's jaw, his ribs, and his nose. Blood sprayed across the straw. Harlan clawed at Eli's face, raking his nails down Eli's cheek, gouging for his eyes. Eli roared, a sound of pure animal fury. He grabbed Harlan by the throat and slammed his head against the floorboards. Thud, thud, thud. "You think you can take her?" Eli snarled, slamming him again. "You think you can threaten my family?" Harlan's eyes rolled back. He was choking, his face turning purple, blood bubbling from his lips. Eli's thumbs dug into his windpipe, crushing the cartilage. The darkness that Eli had held at bay for years, the darkness of the bounty hunter, the killer, rose up to claim him. He wanted to end it. He wanted to snap Harlan's neck and drag his body into the woods. "Eli!" The scream cut through the red haze. Eli froze. His hands were still locked around Harlan's throat. He looked up, standing in the barn doorway, illuminated by the flickering lantern light, were Thomas and Sarah. They were barefoot in the dirt, clutching each other, their eyes wide with absolute terror. They weren't looking at Harlan. They were looking at him. They were looking at the monster. And behind them stood Clara, the rifle raised, pointed not at Harlan, but at the roof. Crack! The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Dust rained down from the rafters. The horses screamed and kicked their stalls. "Get off him!" Clara yelled, her voice cracking with the force of her command. "Eli Boone, get off him right now!" Eli looked down at Harlan, who was wheezing, half-conscious, life fluttering in his chest like a dying moth. He looked back at Thomas. The boy was crying silent tears, terrified of the man he had called Pa. The shame hit Eli harder than any bullet. He released Harlan's throat as if it were red-hot iron. He scrambled backward, crab-walking away until his back hit the grain bin. He sat there, breathing heavily, his hands shaking violently. Clara walked into the barn. She didn't look at Eli. She kept the rifle trained on Harlan, who was rolling onto his side, coughing up blood and bile. "Get up," Clara said to Harlan. Her voice was cold steel. Harlan groaned, trying to push himself up. His face was a ruin. One eye was swollen shut, his nose was flattened, and his suit was destroyed. He tried to kill me," Harlan wheezed, spitting a tooth onto the floor. "You saw it. He's a killer." "I saw a man protecting his home from a thief," Clara said. She stepped closer, the barrel of the Winchester leveled at his chest. "You broke into my house. You threatened my husband. I own you," Harlan gurgled, his madness still flickering. "You owe me the debt." Clara walked right up to him. She pressed the barrel of the rifle against his sternum, hard enough to bruise. "Look at me, Harlan," she hissed. "Look at me." He squinted up at her with his good eye. "You never owned me," she said, her voice low and fierce. "Not when I was a girl. Not when you killed my husband with your greed. And certainly not now. I am not a debt to be collected. I am a woman who survived you." She pulled the hammer of the rifle back. The click was loud in the silence. "If you ever set foot on this land again," she said, "I won't warn you, and I won't miss it. Do you understand?" Harlan nodded. A jerky, terrified motion. "Get out!" Harlan scrambled to his feet, stumbling, nearly falling. He didn't look at Eli. He limped out of the barn, vanishing into the dark rain that had finally begun to fall. Clara lowered the rifle. She turned to the children. She dropped the gun and fell to her knees, opening her arms. "Come here," she sobbed. "Come here." Thomas and Sarah ran to her, burying their faces in her neck. Clara held them tight, rocking them, whispering that it was over. Eli remained by the grain bin, sitting in the shadows, watching the family he thought he had just lost. He looked at his hands, stained with Harlan's blood. He felt sick. The sheriff arrived an hour later. Harlan had collapsed on the road halfway back to town, and a passing drover had found him. Sheriff Pickett was a stern man, but fair. He rode into the yard with 2 deputies and, to everyone's surprise, Reverend Lowe. They found Harlan sitting in the back of the deputy's wagon, nursing his broken face. He was shouting about attempted murder, about warrants, about Eli Boone being a fugitive. Eli stood on the porch, his hands washed but his face still bruised. Clara stood beside him, her hand gripping his forearm so tight her nails dug in. "He trespassed," Clara told the sheriff. "He came in the night with a weapon. He threatened my children. He beat me to death," Harlan screamed from the wagon. "Arrest him! He's a murderer!" Sheriff Pickett looked at Harlan, then at Eli. He walked up the steps and looked at the branding iron that Eli had left leaning against the rail. "Evidence. This yours, Boone?" Pickett asked. "No," Eli said. Pickett turned to Harlan. "You brought a branding iron to a man's house in the middle of the night. Harlan, what were you intending to do? Brand the woman?" The gathered men, the deputies, even the drover, looked at Harlan with disgust. In the West, there were rules. You didn't bring violence to a woman and children in the dark. "He has a warrant!" Harlan shrieked. "In Denver, for Cyrus Vance!" Pickett paused. He looked at Eli. "Is that true, son?" Eli opened his mouth to confess, to accept the chains. "My husband defended himself against a loan shark 3 years ago." Clara interrupted, her voice ringing clear in the night air. "He was a bounty hunter doing his job. If there is paper on it, it is paper bought by criminals." Pickett looked at Clara. He saw the fire in her eyes. He looked at the bruises on her neck where the stress had made her skin flush. "Reverend," Pickett said, turning to the preacher, "you came along to see justice done. What do you see?" Reverend Lowe looked at Harlan McCrae, a rich man, a powerful man, now revealed as a petty, violent tyrant. He looked at Clara Hayes, standing beside her husband, a woman who had been spat upon and shamed, yet stood with a dignity that shamed them all. The townspeople who had followed the sheriff's wagon, a blacksmith, a few farmers, were watching. They had seen Harlan's cruelty. They remembered the spit on the blue dress. "I see a man who has lost his way," Reverend Lowe said quietly. He pointed at Harlan. "And it is not Mr. Boone." The silence that followed was the sound of a town turning its back on its golden calf. "Harlan McCrae," Sheriff Pickett said, pulling a pair of irons from his belt. "You're under arrest for trespassing, assault, and disturbing the peace." "You can't," Harlan wailed as the deputies hauled him down. "I run this town." "Not tonight you don't," Pickett said. They hauled him away. The wagons turned around. The rain fell harder, washing the tracks from the yard. The days that followed were a revelation. The arrest of Harlan McCrae broke the dam of fear in Iron Creek. Without his money and his threats choking the town, people began to remember their own humanity. It started small. 3 days after the fight, a buckboard pulled up to the ranch gate. It was Mrs. Gable, the woman who had spat on Clara. She didn't come to the door. She left a bundle on the porch and drove away quickly. Clara opened it to find 5 yards of fine wool flannel and a jar of peach preserves. There was no note, but the apology was woven into the wool. Then came Mr. Henderson, a farmer who lived 2 miles east. He brought a crate of laying hens. "Heard you might need eggs for the young ones," he muttered to Eli, looking at his boots. "Harland, well, he squeezed us all. Eli, we shouldn't have let him squeeze you." Eli shook the man's hand. It was the first time a neighbor had shaken his hand in 5 years. The isolation was ending. The wound of the town was healing, but the healing inside the cabin was slower and deeper. One evening, a week after the fight, Eli heated water in the big copper tub in front of the fire. The children were asleep. The rain was tapping a gentle rhythm on the roof. He filled the tub, the steam rising in the cool air. "Clara," he called softly. She came out of the bedroom. She looked tired. The stress of the last months hung on her, but her eyes were bright. "The water is hot," Eli said. "For you." Clara looked at the tub, then at him. She walked over to him and began to unbutton his shirt. "For us," she said. Eli hesitated. "I ain't clean. Clara, I still feel the blood on my hands." "Then let me wash it off," she whispered. They stripped in the firelight, shedding clothes like old skins. They stepped into the water together, the copper tub large enough to hold them both if they sat close. Eli sat with his back to the rim, and Clara settled between his legs, leaning back against his chest. The water was scalding hot, shocking and soothing all at once. Clara took the bar of soap and a cloth. She turned in his arms, resting her knees on the bottom of the tub so she could face him. She washed his chest. She washed the scars, the bullet hole, the knife marks. She washed his neck, where the tension sat in hard knots. "I thought I lost you," Eli whispered. His eyes closed. In the barn, when Thomas looked at me, I thought I saw him seeing a devil. "He saw a father," Clara said firmly, running the soapy cloth over his broad shoulders. "He saw a man who would fight a dragon to save him. He told me yesterday that he wants to be strong like you." Eli opened his eyes. They were wet. "I nearly killed him." "Clara, I wanted to—" "But you didn't," Clara said. She reached up and cupped his wet face. "You stopped. That is the difference between a monster and a man. The monster doesn't stop." She leaned forward and kissed him. It was a slow, languid kiss, tasting of steam and soap. "I don't want just survival anymore. Eli," she murmured against his lips. "I don't want just a partnership. I don't want to just get through the winter." "What do you want?" Eli asked, his voice husk. "I want this," she said, moving her hips slightly in the water, pressing against him. "I want passion. I want to know that when you touch me, it isn't because you are protecting me, but because you cannot help yourself. I want to belong to you. Truly." Eli gripped her hips, pulling her closer until there was no space between them. "You have me, Clara. Every broken piece of me. I am yours." They made love in the water, slow and slippery and deep. It wasn't frantic like the first time. It was a reclaiming. It was a baptism. They washed away the shame of the butcher shop, the violence of the barn, the ghosts of the past. They emerged from the water clean. June arrived with a riot of wildflowers. The valley was painted in larkspur, Indian paintbrush, and lupine. On a Sunday morning, under a sky so blue it looked painted, they walked to a clearing near the creek. A grove of aspen trees formed a natural cathedral, their leaves shivering like silver coins in the breeze. There was no preacher. They didn't need one. God was in the wind and the water and the soil. Thomas stood straight and tall, holding his hat in his hands. Sarah wore a crown of dandelions Clara had woven for her. Clara wore the blue dress. The stain was gone, scrubbed out with lie and determination. They stood facing each other. "I didn't have a ring before," Eli said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't have much of anything." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather cord. Hanging from it was a silver dollar. Clara recognized it. It was a coin from the saloon, but it was different now. Eli had taken it to the forge. He had heated it, hammered it, polished it until the face of the coin was gone, replaced by a smooth, shining surface. He had drilled a small hole through the top. "This was the price of a life once," Eli said, holding it up. "Or so we thought. I kept it to remind me of what I saved. But I was wrong." He placed the necklace over her head. The silver disc settled cool against her skin, right over her heart. "You were never saved, Clara," Eli said, looking into her eyes. "You didn't need saving. You needed a place to stand. You saved yourself, and then you saved me." Clara touched the coin. It wasn't a symbol of shame anymore. It was a symbol of value. It was the silver of the moon, the silver of the aspen bark. Clara," she whispered, her voice steady and strong. "Take you, Eli, not for food, not for wood, not for safety. I take you for your heart. I take you for your scars." She stepped closer and took his hands. "I was starving when I met you," she said. "But I am full now. I chose you, Eli Boone, in the snow, in the dark, in fear. I chose you, and I choose you now, in the light." Eli leaned down and kissed her. The children cheered, a high, joyous sound that startled a hawk from the branches above. They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, the four of them. The shadows of the past stretched long behind them, but they were walking into the sun. Harlan McCrae was in a jail cell in Cheyenne. The town of Iron Creek was learning to be kind again, and in the high pasture, the cattle were fat and the grass was tall. Clara touched the silver coin at her throat and smiled. She wasn't afraid of the winter anymore. Let it come. They had fire enough to last a lifetime. The high country summer arrived not with a whisper, but with a shout of green. The valley, so long entombed in the white silence of winter and the gray mud of spring, exploded into life. The meadow grass grew tall enough to brush the stirrups of a riding horse, swaying in the warm wind like a vast inland sea. The creek, no longer a torrent of ice melt, settled into a clear, musical run, flashing silver over stones that had been scrubbed clean by the season. At the Boone Ranch, the change was more than just weather. It was a resurrection. Clara Hayes, now Clara Boone in every sense of the word, stood in her garden. It was no longer the patch of desperate hope she had clawed out of the half-frozen mud in April. It was a fortress of abundance. Rows of pole beans climbed high on cedar stakes, their leaves forming a cool, green tunnel. Tomato vines, heavy with fruit that was just beginning to blush red, scented the air with their sharp, earthy perfume. Squash blossoms opened like golden trumpets in the morning sun, buzzing with fat bumblebees. Clara wiped her hands on her apron. She looked toward the pasture where the cattle grazed. The herd had grown. The calves that had been dropped in the wet spring were now sturdy and sleek, their coats shining with health. Eli had been right about the land. It was a hard, unforgiving country, but if you treated it with respect, it gave back tenfold. She walked to the edge of the garden, leaning against the split-rail fence. She watched the figure of her husband near the corral. Eli was working as a young colt, a skittish bay with a white star on its forehead. He moved with that fluid, quiet economy that still made her breath catch in her throat. He didn't force the animal. He invited it to trust him. It was hard to believe that 6 months ago, she had been standing in the snow outside a saloon, shivering in a coat too thin to stop the wind, bargaining away her soul for a sack of flour. That woman felt like a stranger now, a ghost who haunted a different life. The peace that had settled over the ranch was profound, but the news from town added a sweetness to the air that even the wildflowers couldn't match. Reverend Lowe was gone. It hadn't been a bolt of lightning that removed him, but the slow, grinding wheel of justice. After Harlan McCrae's arrest, the books of the town began to open. People started talking. It turned out the Reverend's condemnation of sinners didn't extend to his own ledger. He had been skimming from the collection plate for years, and worse. He had been taking donations from Harlan to turn a blind eye to the man's land grabs and intimidation tactics. When the truth came out, exposed by the very sheriff the Reverend had tried to manipulate, the town's piety turned to outrage. They didn't run him out on a rail. They simply stopped coming. He preached to empty pews for 2 Sundays, his voice echoing off the bare walls, until the silence drove him mad. He packed his bags in the dead of night and took the stagecoach east, leaving behind a scandal and a town that felt suddenly lighter. Clara heard the news from the miller when she went to buy grain. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile in triumph. She simply closed her eyes, took a deep breath of the flour-dusted air, and felt the last heavy chain of shame fall from her shoulders. The voice that had called her a whore from the pulpit was silenced. She was free. With the external threats gone, life on the ranch turned inward, focusing on the delicate work of building a future. Eli took his role as a father figure seriously, approaching it with the same methodical care he applied to breaking horses or mending fences. He saw that Thomas was growing, that the boy's eyes were always watching him, hungry for instruction. One afternoon, Clara looked out the window to see them walking toward the tree line. Eli carried his Winchester rifle. Thomas carried a tin can. She dried her hands and went to the porch to watch. They stopped at the edge of the clearing. Eli set the can on a stump, then walked back 20 paces. He knelt on one knee in the grass, bringing himself down to the boy's level. "A gun is a tool," Clara heard Eli's deep voice carry in the breeze. "It ain't a toy, and it ain't a voice. You don't use it to make people listen to you. You use it to put meat on the table or to stop a wolf. You understand?" "Yes, Eli," Thomas said, his back ramrod straight. "And you never," Eli continued, handing the heavy rifle to the boy, "never pointed at something you don't intend to destroy. Once the bullet leaves the barrel, you can't call it back. It's gone forever, just like a harsh word, but with blood behind it." Clara watched as Eli adjusted Thomas's stance. He touched the boy's shoulder gently, correcting the angle of his elbow. He was teaching him to shoot, yes, but he was teaching him something far more important: consequence. He was teaching him that strength was not about violence, but about control. Thomas fired. The kick knocked him back a step, but he held on. The dirt kicked up 3 feet to the left of the can. "High and left," Eli said calmly. "You jerk the trigger. Squeeze it like you're squeezing a lemon. Slow." They stayed out there for an hour until Thomas finally sent the can spinning into the grass. The look on the boy's face, pure, unadulterated pride, was a light that rivaled the sun. Eli didn't cheer. He just nodded and ruffled the boy's hair. But Clara saw the softness in his eyes. That evening, after supper, Eli sat by the fire with a block of cedar wood and his pocket knife. He had been working on it for weeks, hiding it whenever Thomas came into the room. "Thomas," Eli said. "Come here." The boy walked over. Eli held out his hand. Sitting in his palm was a horse. It was carved with exquisite detail: the arch of the neck, the flow of the mane, the muscles of the flank. It was a galloping horse, frozen in a moment of pure freedom. "It's the roan," Thomas breathed, his eyes wide. "It's for you." Eli said, "Every cowboy needs a herd. This is your start." Thomas took the wooden horse as if it were made of glass. He looked at Eli, and for the first time, he didn't just see a protector. He saw a father. "Thank you, Pa," Thomas whispered. The words slipped out naturally this time. Eli didn't flinch. He didn't correct him. He just swallowed hard and turned back to the fire, his ears turning a faint shade of pink. While Eli taught the boy the ways of the land, Clara took charge of their souls. She began teaching Sarah to read. They didn't have a school primer, so they used the only book in the house, the heavy family Bible that had traveled with Clara from her childhood home. They sat on the porch swing in the afternoons, the heat of the day softening into a golden haze. Sarah sat on Clara's lap, her small finger tracing the lines of text. Clara was selective. She skipped the verses of judgment. She skipped the stories of pillars of salt and plagues of locusts. She had lived through enough plagues. "Read this one," Clara said, pointing to a verse in Matthew. Blessed are the merciful." Sarah stumbled through the words, sounding them out phonetically. "For they shall obtain mercy." "That is right," Clara said, smoothing Sarah's hair. "Do you know what mercy is, baby?" Sarah thought for a moment. swinging her legs. Is it when Eli didn't hurt the bad man in the barn? Clara paused. The memory of that night was still a dark bruise on her mind, but Sarah's interpretation was full of light. Yes, Clara said softly. That is exactly what it is. Mercy is having the power to hurt and choosing to heal instead. Like you? Sarah asked, looking up with innocent eyes. Me? You fixed Eli's hand when it was bleeding, and you fixed his heart. He smiles now. Mama, he never used to smile. Clara hugged her daughter tight, burying her face in the smell of sunshine and soap that clung to the girl's hair. We fixed each other, Sarah. That is what families do. In July, the time came for the summer social in Iron Creek. In years past, Clara would have hidden in her shack, terrified of the stairs. Even after the marriage, she had gone to town with her head down, armed for battle. But this time was different. We are going, Eli announced one morning, and we are going to dance. Clara looked at him, wiping dishwater from her hands. Eli, I don't know if... We are done hiding. Clara, he said. He walked over and kissed her forehead. Wear the blue dress. They rode into town on the buckboard, the children sitting in the back, scrubbed clean and dressed in their Sunday best. The town was decorated with bunting. A fiddle player was already sawing out a tune on a platform near the courthouse. The smell of roasting corn and barbecue beef filled the air. When Eli helped Clara down from the wagon, a hush rippled through the crowd nearby. They remembered the spit, they remembered the accusations, but they also remembered the truth that had come out about Harland and the preacher. They looked at Clara, standing tall in her blue calico, her silver coin necklace gleaming at her throat. They looked at Eli, clean-shaven and steady. They didn't look like sinners, they looked like victors. Eli offered her his arm. Mrs. Boone. Mr. Boone, she replied, taking it. They walked down the center of the street. Clara felt the eyes on her, but she didn't shrink. She met them. She nodded to Mrs. Miller. She smiled at the blacksmith, and slowly, miraculously, the town nodded back. Mrs. Miller offered a tentative wave. The blacksmith tipped his hat. The wall of judgment had crumbled, replaced by a grudging respect. They had weathered the storm. And in the West, survival was the only virtue that truly mattered. They reached the platform where the dancing had begun. The fiddler struck up a waltz, slow and sweet. Eli turned to her. He took her hand and placed his other hand on her waist. He pulled her close, closer than was perhaps proper for a public street, but not so close as to be scandalous. They are watching, Clara whispered, looking up at him. Let them watch, Eli said. His eyes locked on hers. Let them see what a man looks like when he is holding his whole world. He spun her. Clara threw her head back and laughed. It was a sound she hadn't made in years. A free, unburdened sound that rose up into the summer sky. They moved together with a grace that belied their rough lives. Two hardships that had found a rhythm. Right there, in the middle of the street, with the dust swirling around their boots and the town watching. Eli stopped spinning. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't a peck. It was a claim. It was deep and tender and entirely unashamed. When they broke apart, there was no jeering, there was no spitting. A few of the older women were smiling behind their fans. The butcher, the man who had once denied her scraps, looked away, shamed by their happiness. Clara held Eli's hand, squeezing it tight. They had won, not by fighting, not by leaving, but by staying and loving each other harder than the world could hate them. That night, the ride home was quiet. The children were asleep in the back, exhausted from the excitement. The moon was full, painting the prairie in shades of blue and silver. Clara sat close to Eli on the bench, her head resting on his shoulder. She watched the wheel of the stars turning overhead. She thought about the journey. She thought about the hunger that had felt like it would never end. She thought about the cold that had seeped into her bones. She thought of the desperate walk to the saloon and the man who had stopped her. It felt like a story told about someone else. When they got home, Eli carried the sleeping children inside. Clara lit the lantern on the table. As the light flared up, something caught her eye. It was a piece of brown wrapping paper lying on the table, weighed down by a stone. It was a drawing Sarah and Thomas must have made before they left for town. Clara picked it up. It was crude, drawn with charcoal from the fire and some chalk. It showed a house, their cabin, with smoke curling from the chimney in perfect spirals. Above it, a yellow sun with long rays beamed down. And standing in front of the house were 4 figures: a tall man with a big hat, a woman in a blue dress, a boy holding a horse, and a little girl holding a flower. But what made Clara's breath catch was that the figures were all holding hands, one unbroken chain. There were no gaps, no stepfather, no widow mother, just us. She felt Eli come up behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on the top of her head. He looked down at the drawing. "They got my nose wrong," he rumbled softly. "I ain't that crooked." Clara laughed, a watery sound. "It is perfect." She turned in his arms, pressing her face into his shirt. The scent of him, leather, dust, and man, was the smell of home. "Eli," she whispered. "Yeah? I'm not afraid anymore." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a mountain, the fear of starvation, of freezing, of judgment, of Harland, of being alone. It was all gone. It had been burned away by the fire in this hearth and the love of this man. Eli held her tighter. "I know, Clara, I know." Later, in the deep quiet of the night, Clara lay in the big bed beside him. The window was open to let in the cool night air. Outside, far off in the hills, a coyote howled, a lonely, wild sound. Once, that sound terrified her. It sounded like death waiting in the dark. Now, it just sounded like the song of the wild country that was their home. The cabin was warm. The woods settled with comforting creaks. She could hear the gentle snore of the man who had saved her life, and whom she had saved in return. Clara placed her hand on her stomach. It was still early yet, too early to show, but she knew. She felt the flutter, the deep, instinctual knowing of a mother. There was a new life growing inside her, a child made not from desperation or duty, but from love. A child who would never know the hunger of the mining camp. A child who would grow up on this land, with a father who carved wooden horses and a mother who taught mercy. She smiled in the dark. "We are going to need another room," she whispered to the sleeping house. Eli shifted in his sleep, his arm instinctively reaching out to drape over her waist, pulling her back against him. Clara closed her eyes. The past was a closed book. The future was a wide, open plain, stretching out as far as the eye could see, green and lush and full of promise. And for the first time in her life, Clara couldn't wait to see what the sunrise would bring. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a journey walking the dusty roads of Iron Creek with Clara and Eli, witnessing their struggle from the bitter cold of winter to the warmth of a hard-won summer. I hope their story of redemption, resilience, and love touched your heart as much as it did mine to write it. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from. It is always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to From Wild West so you don't miss the next adventure. And finally, I'd love to know your thoughts in English. Did you think Eli made the right choice in sparing Harland? What was your favorite moment in their journey? Until next time, keep your fires burning and your hearts open.